To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me. Oh.
So we decided that we want to explore a little bit the power imbalance between game A and game B, especially at the threshold. Once game B is big enough to be noticed by game A, and then to be perceived as some form of threat, or even worse, maybe lootable, because there's something that is to be looted inside of game B that's interesting to game A. Which then would really highlight the probable kinetic power imbalance, for sure outside of the US, maybe not inside of the US, because as you point out, there are more guns in the US than human beings. So that could be possible in the US, but systemically, how do we think about this? So that's something we would like to explore a little today.
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic and one that we've been talking about as part of the Game B discourse before there was a Game B, because it's an obvious one that if you really are going to do something revolutionary, there may well come a time where there's actually two risks. The first and the more obvious one is the host decides to crush us for whatever reason. But there's a second one, which is a little less obvious, but happens more often, which is that we get co-opted by Game A, right? That it's, in the same way that the 60s quote unquote attempt to build a new civilization basically got co-opted into the music companies and the fashion industries and what have you. And next thing you know, it was no different than Game A, with a little bit more sex and rock and roll and drugs, but that was about it, right? And so I think both of those are risks that we need to consider from the beginning. But let's talk first about the one that you focused on, which is the sort of serious, potentially kinetic, existential risks that Game B could have as its puissance grows. Right? Now, the first insight we had on this, at least the first insight I had on this, I think other people came eventually to agree with it, is that at least in the West, where rule of law exists, plus or minus, right? It's a little bit under stress at the moment in the US and other places. But in general, the rule of law is still the basis of our society. In those places, a very interesting strategy with both pros and cons, but I believe more pros than cons, is strict legality. Under rule of law, there are considerable defenses against expropriation, conquest, looting, etc. But this is what the 60s people forgot, the Black Panthers and the hippies and all these guys, is once you start violating the law, you've given the authorities a stick to beat you with. And so if you commit to strict legality, you eliminate a number of the levers that the power of B can use to expropriate you, imprison you, kill you, whatever. But it does come at a cost. For instance, we know that certainly in the US, and I believe in Western Europe as well, there's lots of laws that get in the way of building Game B. Things like health department regulations. For instance, in most US states, it's illegal to build a community based on composting toilets rather than a sewage treatment plant. I mean, why is that? That's like nuts, but that's the law. And if you violate that law, you have just given the powers that be the right to shut you down, or at least make your life incredibly miserable. Now, the U.S. is relatively good in having liberal homeschooling laws. Easy to these days to get homeschool your children. Friends of mine in Europe say much more difficult in Europe, particularly France, but other places as well. That the amount of red tape you have to jump through is such that most people are never going to do it, and the opportunity to build schools in competition with the state schools is much less feasible. So one could violate the law and do it anyway. But again, that gives the authorities the right to come in and arrest the parents or take the kids and put them in foster care or something. I don't know what the consequences are. But so the commitment to strict legality does come at the cost of not being able to do early some things that we might otherwise want to do. But if we take seriously the risk of reaction, then it strikes me strict legality buys us some time, at least for quite a while.
Okay, so strict legality, especially when we think about a physical community somewhere, already hits the often really tricky boundary of zoning and building code, right? As you know yourself. And some friends of ours have gone through that abandoned projects for that exact reason. But expanding what is possible in terms of constructing houses is definitely one of the core features, to me at least, of exploring new modalities, right, outside of the current system. So the constraints are pretty large, and I think the niches in which to really change something within the constraints of game A are far and few, right? So I'm not 100% convinced that it is even possible to build game B kind of structures within the legal constraints without breaking any laws in the current modality.
Now, in the United States, probably more so than in, say, much of Western Europe, except perhaps Switzerland, the states vary tremendously with regard to things like building codes and zonings. Just across the line from where my farm is in Virginia, which has very strict zoning and building codes, over in parts of West Virginia, there's no zoning at all, and the building codes are remarkably commonsensical. So you can put up a rammed earth house if you want. No one will say anything about it, right? And you can put 5 houses on land, and there's a minor amount of paperwork, but not any long zoning process. It's also true of some of the Western states, and at least parts of the Western states. So one way to finesse it, at least in the U.S., is jurisdiction shopping. Find the places where you can do much more by right. I know they're probably not going to be close to big cities, so that's another trade-off, right? There's some advantage to being within an hour of an international airport, for instance. But if you have the right to build rammed earth houses and use composting toilets and homeschool your kids, West Virginia is particularly good for homeschooling, as it turns out, and charter schools. And even better, West Virginia allows a new town to be formed with a relatively small number of people, a couple of hundred, I believe it is. So again, you can get even more control of your local community, get 200 people together, get yourself established as a town, and you have additional legal power. So I've long counseled people interested in doing proto-Bs and other kinds of on-the-ground communities to spend a lot of time investigating the legal infrastructure in the areas that they're considering building. Because, as you say, we both know people who have spent significant amounts of money trying to do things. In one case, I told them flat out when they proposed the project, it's impossible. It'll never happen. And I was right. And they bought the property before they had thought through the hoops that they'd have to hop through. And eventually the project was abandoned. So that's a key method of strict legality. Find out where what you can do is legal and do it there. Now, here's the next step, which is particularly in these rural areas, it does not take a lot of votes to be significant in elections. So, for instance, a county of say 5,000 people, if you have 200 people, and they all vote, it's probably 10% of the vote. 10% is enough to swing most local elections. So you get yourself something going, and you basically say, all right, we're going to talk to the people running for the county commission. And here's what we want, people. We don't really give a shit about most of the issues you care about. We don't care about them at all. The only one we care about is making the following change in the building code. If you'll commit to doing that, our whole community will vote for you, every single person. So there's a way to leverage democracy into modifying the operating system, modifying the legal operating system, even at fairly small numbers of people, if you're in areas with relatively low population density. So we think that's important. Then over time, as we talk about where it gets to the tipping point, which could be 5%, something like that. 5% of the United States would be 10 million voters, at least, right? 10 million voters would swing any presidential election these days. So again, they're fortunately, at least as long as the rule of law and democracy hold, not a guarantee by any means, but as long as it does, as we get closer to the tipping point, our ability to demand legislation favorable to us increases. And so, you're at 10 million voters, and you say, for instance, charter schools will be legal everywhere. Now, in the U.S., charter schools are really easy in some places, like New Mexico, where I used to live, and really difficult, like in Virginia. Charter school basically means that anybody can start a school. They have to meet certain state requirements, but not too many. And they get a stipend from the state equal to, usually it's like 75 or 80% of the per student funding in that county. And it's a lot of money. So, in our county, the per capita expenditure per student's on the order of $20,000 US. So 80% of that would be $16,000 per student. You can do a hell of a good charter school for $16,000 a student. And so once we become a national political, first, at a state level, you could convince the state of Virginia to modify its laws on charter schools. And the funny thing is that the Virginia rules on charter schools are very good until you get to like one bit of fine print. It's all great, including startup funding and a information sharing institution, all this. But then at the very bottom, it says, to set up a charter school requires the permission of the current school board in the jurisdiction where you're at. And they'll never give it to you. I think there's like 5 charter schools in the whole state of Virginia. While in New Mexico, you have the right to establish a charter school, and it only has to be approved by a board of academics at the University of New Mexico. They don't have a vested interest. In fact, they mostly like charter schools. And so almost all reasonable charter schools get approved. There's hundreds of them in New Mexico, which is a much smaller state in population than Virginia. So politics becomes one of the next counters. Once you get big enough to worry about, you're also big enough to influence the game itself.
Okay. Big enough in that sense implies that there's strong federation between the many little islands, right? So the proto-Bs by definition aren't very large in and of themselves, so they need to have a very, very strong cohesive power between them, which then opens up yet a fully new attack vector, because and which can be hijacked internally by some dark triads individuals potentially, so that there needs to be countermeasure against that, but can also be attacked from the outside, both in terms of like legal, kinetic, but also infrastructure, right? If the infrastructure for that federation, for that organization between proto-Bs goes away, that capacity goes away. So how do you think about that?
Well, I would, in terms of structure, I would imagine there being meta membranes, right? The idea of membranics is that there's stacked membranes, there's interpenetrating membranes. Many people will be a member of 5 or 6 or 10 different membranes, but there could also be a coordination membranes that most membranes are members of. That could be the political membranes, and it may probably at multiple levels. Your local region, your county,
Mm-hmm.
your state, and national, and that there would be a mechanism to reach agreement on what it is we want to accomplish in the political realm. And one of the things I have strongly counseled about Game B from the beginning is Game B should not get into the usual political partisan fights. Don't be identified with Team Red or Team Blue. In fact, we've been remarkably successful at that. We have people from both Team Red and Team Blue, and one of our rules is at Game B events or online venues, no discussion of Game A politics. Thank you very much, right? Because that's nothing but divisive. And let those people work out their stuff. If we're going to take political stands, it's going to be about things which we believe to be beneficial for the Game B project. So I think that's quite important. So anyway, so first imagine that there exist high-level, medium, and higher-level membranes, which through some governance process, maybe liquid democracy, maybe something else, these membranes come to a conclusion on what our political stance is. And we ask as part of the accords, which would be a downwardly inheritable accord, that members of the subsidiary membranes commit to vote for the slate recommended by the political membrane. So this is a way to coordinate power, to concentrate power from many small communities into a coordinating mechanism at a high level, which goes through quite a long deliberative process. I would imagine may even require the equivalent of referenda down to the primary membranes, and then back up to take a strong nationwide political position, such as, for instance, making charter schools by right, essentially. That might well take a year or two to work out whether that's the right thing to do and what exactly should the language be, et cetera. With respect to the infrastructure, fortunately, it's getting harder and harder to fuck up coordination infrastructure. So long as the internet exists, there's means to communicate. Of course, we know places like Iran will periodically shut down the internet, but then we have things like Starlink, which can get around the choking of the physical routers, and I've talked about this with folks before. We could even build completely parallel communication structures that use things like shortwave radio, for instance. Low bandwidth, but if we really needed to coordinate, certainly it's at least as good as the letters on horseback that the American Revolution was organized with. That's literally how committees of correspondence. People wrote letters to each other, and the letters were carried on horseback across the country. And they were able to defeat the world's strongest empire. So I imagine shortwave radio that could send data would be enough, if need be, to coordinate across the community.
It actually exists. There are open source projects that can use basically any data delivery methods to hook into a broader network, so that you can use short, long, or whatever waves you have in order to bridge. So that's already there and open source. So that just needs to be used.
It needs to be built probably on a standby basis, ready to go and tested regularly. That if someone were to crunch the internet, how would we operate? And it should be a regular part of thinking through the infrastructure for the new civilization. And maybe even as a last resort, on foot communication, right? If things really get bad, that that there's a already designed method for circulating governance materials amongst the entities, even if we do it on foot or on horseback, right? Again, it was done before on foot and on horseback. So we have various fallback strategies.
So what do you think of when you say when things get bad?
And I think there's two ways things get bad, and they and it's important to distinguish between the two. One, if we think about the fifth attractor hypothesis, that one of the attractors is chaos, where systems fall apart, in which case the risks are principally local, right? That your community is going to be attacked by its neighbors or by criminal gangs, or after some period of time, warlords. Typically, if you look at history, what chaos happens first, it breaks down to local gangs, and then one of those gang leaders turns out to be a more charismatic sociopath than the others, and he ends up either conquering or, more at least as often, enticing the other warlords or gangs to come in with him, and then he becomes a warlord and is able to control a fairly large area. For this kind of local risk, particularly in the smaller stages where you're dealing with local criminal gangs, motorcycle gangs, etc., it may well be feasible for communities to be able to protect themselves if they're prepared. As I mentioned, in the U.S., it's not nearly as hard as it may be elsewhere. There's 330 million people. There's an estimate of 450 million guns in private hands, which is pretty nuts. By the end of 2030, there'll be about 50 million AR-15s in private hands, which is amazing, right? At first, it's kind of horrifying, but so on one level, it's horrifying. There's some risk of mass shootings and things. On the other side, it's a number that nobody could conquer the United States, including the U.S. Army, with 50 million ARs in private hands.
As long as those people are coordinated.
If they're coordinated, and of course they don't end up in, as it may well happen, two factions, 25 million each, slaughtering each other, which is fairly often. Again, an advantage that Game B could have is coordination, right? That we are committed to mutual aid, so that much like on the American frontier, where Indians would attack one community, the militias from all the communities would come together. There could be an agreement amongst communities that should one of them be attacked, it's considered an attack on all, very much like the NATO Article 5. Again, now keep in mind, none of these things are going to be foolproof. If a warlord gets too big too fast, you're going to be in trouble. And one of the important things when thinking about catastrophe and pre-planning against that is that you can't pre-plan for every scenario. All you can do is plan for an ensemble of scenarios which are realistic. Just like I tell preppers, I wouldn't bother prepping for a 10-kilometer asteroid hitting the Earth. Just put your head between your legs and kiss your ass goodbye. It's over. For most people, planning for a 5-year outage of the electric grid is probably not realistic. So on the other hand, planning for a 90-day outage of the electric grid is probably a good idea, and is some work and some expense, but is doable by so that's particularly a community that could get itself ready to exist without the grid for 9 months or for a few months. Though probably not for 10 years, so maybe for 10 years, with enough good thinking about heliocentric civilization.
Yeah. So effectively, what I'm hearing is that you're saying in collective coordination between the different instances of proto-Bs or similar implementations, there's pruning of the adjacent possible towards more desirable outcomes for Game B, and strategic positioning of power towards being able to do that. So in the political game, it's voting power, essentially saying this is the amount of votes you can get if you move the adjacent possible in the political game towards this end. What other forms of power? So there's potential for kinetic power, right? Just having enough AK-47s, plus the coordination layer. and the political power, and obviously also material power and economic power. How do you think about these two at scale?
Well, let me add one more, and I think it may be the most
Mm,
important of all, which is
okay.
cultural power.
Mm,
Uh, once game B gets to some modest scale, let's say 0.3%, say 1 million people in the United States, uh, and we're doing a good job, we will have tremendous cultural power. People will know about
mm,
what we're doing. They'll be trying to understand what we're doing. People will come visit
mm,
to
mm,
Airbnbs. They'll participate in community activities. They'll interact with missionaries from the monastery,
mm,
etc. And if we're lucky and we do a good job, and we're not counter programmed too successfully, the general perception in society, even people who are not engaged with Game B, is that Game B is a good thing, that these are people trying to save humanity from itself. They're surprisingly unself-serving. They're not corrupt. They operate under radical transparency. And so why would we allow our powers that be to try to suppress them? And
mhm.
in some ways, a cultural win could be more powerful and happen more quickly than some of the other ones we talked about. We could certainly get to cultural salience long before we got the political salience, for instance.
Okay, so and let's quickly touch on the material and also on the purely economic, because as we established in a couple of conversations ago, we need roughly an influx of 3 billion per year for the US for the scenario of building enough proto-Bs to get to that point in the US. Um, so those two present other attack vectors. And then let's talk about the potential attack vectors on the cultural, on the economic, on the material, etc. Let's go through them all quickly and then
Yeah,
see
let's start
how
with the
we can
cultural one, because
harden.
that's at the
Yeah,
tip of my mind at the moment.
yeah, yeah,
What
yeah.
are the attack? Of course, every culture is nothing but uh, you know, essentially memetic competition. So
Mm-hmm,
presumably, just as the hippies were laughed at and categorized as bad citizens, no doubt there will be counter programming against game B. It's elitist or it's this or it's that, and so we'll have to engage in memetic warfare like any idea does.
okay. So now the issue that comes up with any kind of preparation for warfare is that it is practically impossible to create peace with war, right? So peace is created from peace and not from war, essentially. And so if we are adopting the language and the methods of warfare inside, that energy needs to be bound really, really well in order not to open pathways of self-hijack from the inside. How do you think about those?
Yeah, I
It
think
both on the
that's
cultural and the kinetic, all of them.
yeah, that's unfortunately, this is where we get into complicated game theory, right?
Mm,
And the multipolar trap. All humanity would be better off if there were no war. If we could go like
mm,
this and warfare disappeared, humanity would be tremendously better off.
mhm,
But it's an exceedingly difficult place to get to, in one step. Particularly when part of the world is still going to be armed and still ready to, use dominator power to inflict its will upon others. Extraordinarily difficult problem, which I don't have the answer to, but someone's going to have to figure out at some point. Because we don't get rid of war, it's going to eventually kill us all,
mm,
in one form or another. Um, so there, again, part of it you touched on it briefly, or maybe I did. We talked about it previously, which is one of the areas we've identified that Game B has to do a much better job of is keeping the dark triad personalities away from the levers of power.
mhm,
You look at somebody like Putin. who has inflicted all this pain on millions of people. Probably hundreds of thousands of Russians have died already, and same number or similar number of Ukrainians. And because there's a demonic person essentially was given the levers of power more or less by accident by a drunk Yeltsin, and a healthy social operating system. One of its prime directives would be keeping dark triad personality types away from the levers of power. Of course, it will also be a key part of the governance system that absolute power by any one person or even a small group of people would be something that the immune system of the culture and the governance mechanism would work against. And I would say those same rules need to obviously be applied to our own membranes so that we don't have dark triad types at the level of power, and that power be role-based rather than position-based, and rotate and be subject to continual audit by a radical transparency. So I think we can apply our same remedies that we support for the wider world to our own entities, and at least substantially increase the probabilities of not becoming captured by just the kind of forces that we're trying to defeat. Mm-hmm. But it's always a struggle, right? None of these things is there a permanent solution to. It's constant vigilance.
Constant vigilance, and about, I don't know, 25 years ago or something, I had a conversation with a very successful music producer. I would worked with people like the Fugees and other people, and we were trying to explore what would happen with the music industry and the internet. And at that time, it was already obvious that the distribution of recorded audio would be dramatically altered. And the question was, what's going to happen to the relationship between the audience and the star? And my position was that we might see more localized stars emerge, right? People who are actually bound to their community, and you could experience their process, their actual live music much more easily on a local level. Now, this guy's position was that humans want kings. Humans want stars. Humans want people to look up to and to reference towards as a whole society. They want to be in some form of relation towards this single figurehead. If that is true, that makes the binding of Dark Triad extremely difficult, because it is really, really hard to bring Light Triad people into those singular star-like positions without them then ultimately turning out to be Dark Triad as well, right? I don't think that what we usually apply here in this conversation, that power corrupts. I think power amplifies, but the people that we should be amplifying are extremely rare. And it's unclear whether we can cultivate the kind of people that should be amplified through power rapidly enough and also bind mistakes in that, which is crucial. So what comes up for you when you hear that?
Well, my initial reaction to your producer friend is what he says is true for the dominator operating system, which has existed for maybe 10,000 years, but does not appear to be a aspect of human nature. We know that for most of human existence, we operated in a radically egalitarian context, the famous Chris Boehm forager operating system, where we relentlessly attacked anyone who tried to establish themselves as the king or the person to be looked up to. That was the whole point of the Forager operating system, was to prevent domination of the regular people by these kinds of folks. And apparently it worked for 290,000 years. And now, of course, if we look back phylogenetically, we are related fairly closely to chimps, who are vicious, hierarchical, alpha male runs the place kinds of folks. But we're probably equally related to bonobos, who also have a hierarchy, but a very different one, female oriented, coalition oriented, etc. So we're living probably in some tension between the two. And so I would suggest that your producer buddy has fully internalized game A logic. And while it may be true within the context of game A, I do not believe it's true within the space of ways humans can live.
Okay, I agree. It's my experience as well. And at the same time, since game A is, and the dominator logic is the dominant system at this point in time, the question remains, is it possible in time to cultivate sufficient amounts of people that are like triads in order to pull this off? And
I don't know. We'll try. One step up here. This is something I've become very interested in the last 6 months. A lot of it in starting with conversations with Brendan Graham Dempsey. And that is that we talk about culture and then politics. Now come around to the view that worldview sits above culture, and that what do we think it's about to be a human? Right, that's what I think of as worldview. What is it we think that we're doing in the world? What game are we playing? Who are we? What is an individual or a dividual, as some people call them? And those may be the only effective attack against people like your producer buddy, who are so heavily enculturated in game A that they can't even imagine that there's an alternative. So coming up with a viral worldview which undoes the foundations of game A, that would be the memetic move to think about how to do. How to do it? No, I don't know. I'm not a great pop culture memeticist, but that would certainly be a very worthy thing if somebody could figure out, or a group of people could figure out what that might look like. Because you're right, game A has a shitload of inertia and the ability for, we talked about earlier, the culture war, which might be earlier to flip than the political war. It's going to be difficult to flip the culture war so long as the cultural assumptions are purely game A. And so we need either I don't know exactly what we need, but some paths could be, what we're working on, which is laying out what a game B culture might look like, so people can compare the two and see which one they like better. But perhaps even faster road is a game B worldview that, when adopted, leads one to the game B culture. I know that's kind of highfalutin, and I'm not sure at all how to do it, but I'm going to lay it out there.
So I would begin with saying that worldview is emerges from the sum of all four ways of knowing, which also means that it is not only propositional, but probably mostly participatory, and therefore is deeply, deeply embedded in the subconscious, in the things that are really, really hard to reach, in the heuristics that make up all of our, or most of our decision making. So it is for most people out of reach, and surely not hackable by mind viruses, at least not quickly or just superficially. But it is more a deep rewriting of one's own operating system at the core level, right? The kernel. That's where the new worldview emerges, and that's hard work, really, really hard work, really, really painful work, and it takes a year or two at least. And uh, so far, one pointer in that direction might be the direct link between Goethe and Schiller in Germany and Barack Obama, because what emerged out of the salons of Goethe and Schiller was what Thomas Bergman and Lena Anderson documented in the Nordic Secret book, right? Which is the Nordic folk high school movement, which was the idea that if you give human beings enough time to really explore what their humanness is about, they will be grounded individuals, which is what they felt at that time during the Enlightenment that was needed, because the future was unclear. They needed to have some grounded individuals to navigate that properly. And both Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks were part of the two Nordic folk high school instantiations in the US. So that's why I draw that link all the way to Barack Obama. But um, the creating these situations in which human beings have a truly safe space to find true grounding in whatever is truest for them in their own personal experience seems to almost all the time unfold something that's very coherent, very similar in all of us. But at the same time, we don't have these kinds of spaces that allow for that to happen.
And this is, of course, why I've long said that things won't happen rapidly until we have instantiations on the ground that people can experience. There's only a small number of people that operate at a high enough level of intellectual abstraction to attempt even to think these things through from first principles. As you pointed out, most people experience things and then draw conclusions from their experiences. So that's one of the reasons why I'm getting kind of anxious to get rolling with actual build outs of actual membranes. And they don't necessarily have to be full bore proto-Bs on the ground. They could be dinner clubs or a bowling league or a babysitting cooperative or a small cooperative business. But provide way for as many people as possible to actually experience the different way of doing it, and then they'll induce from that the principles rather than the other way around.
Because it's essentially creating a safe space for an experiment. In the best possible way, this is an experiment at a communal level, but it could also be an individual level, like going to a Nordic folk high school, which is possible. But at a very small scale, have your dinner club, and that dinner club as a safe space in which to explore other modalities, but the safe space is the important anchor here. And we talked about that when we talked about the personal institutional spiral.
Yeah,
Right?
and then
To create these.
and whether formal or informal, that each safe space has a set of accords, which is something we've all agreed to. This is how we're going to operate in this container. And having that discussion itself, I think, will be liberating to people, because one of the diagnoses myself and others have made about game A is it feels like it's just everything is just handed to you. This is your role. You're a producer. You're a consumer. You are a voter, etc. One of the beauties of the accord concept with respect to the perimeter is the membrane is that we are self-creating our operating system, and so that we own it, right? Which is both a scary thing sometimes, but also very empowering, as opposed to running through life feeling like every role that you play is just handed to you by somebody else. And I believe that once people experience that, building their own operating system, they're going to really like it. Of course, there'll be lots of ugly fights too, as we all know. Humans trying to govern each other is lots of conflict. But once, if we can find mechanisms that people can come into coherence, people are going to find that quite amazing.
Why do you think it's necessary that there will be fights? Because I have sufficient experience in my life that tells me the opposite. That
That would be great.
it,
I've,
bring
I
bring
guess I've,
together the right people. Like you know that I practice the no asshole rule, and I've been practicing that for about 15 years now, which makes it almost impossible to get into a fight. Because you're even if you don't agree, you always have a way to resolve things.
Yeah, of course, that's an operating system. That's a governance modality. How to resolve things when you disagree.
Mhm.
Gregory Bateson has established a concept called schismogenesis,
Mhm.
which is not well known, but I wish more people knew about it. In fact, maybe I'm going to write a Substack about it this week. I should do that, which is that even relatively small differences can tend to divide a group into two. There seems to be, unfortunately, something about human nature that people like to divide on, single or a small number of issues. And I even go back to the early Game B days where we basically fissioned over institutions first or personal change first. And we had no real mechanism to realize the obvious answer, both together. And so there was an example of good-hearted people, smart people, who nonetheless could not find their way to the solution. I would say none of them were assholes, or at least no more asshole-ish than you would expect.
Okay, so it's that requires the ability to let go of your own position as the dominating position, right? That you allow multiple positions to coexist at the same time, and then create a dance between them that creates more than the sum of its parts, which usually is the case, and which usually can only be experienced. That this is the case.
But we probably did a bad job in the early Game B case, not thinking about governance anywhere near enough and how to live with and benefit from internal differences of perspective. Because we don't want to have a monoculture per se, and difference is useful.
Of course, I mean that's kind of excusable at that point because you're still finding a way out of Game A at that point, right? Which is how many years ago?
That was 2013, so that would have been
Yeah.
12 years ago.
Mm.
Actually, 13 years ago.
So what would have been some mechanisms to prevent schismogenesis in that early phase of Game B from your perspective today? How would you have gone about it differently?
I think we should have named.
If you imagine the same people, right?
Yeah.
The same dynamics, how would you do it?
Yeah, thinking back on it, the biggest mistake we made was not naming it and bringing it forward. It was a thing that it was basically, down in the weeds, even though people were going in different directions and were starting to get angry with each other, particularly around resource allocations and things of that ilk. But I don't think we ever actually named it, or at least not until very late in the day when it was too late. So a person who is very skilled, or multiple people who are very skilled at understanding group dynamics, who have a role of calling out these kinds of things as early as possible, I think would have helped. Because these were smart, good-hearted people committed to the mission. And if we'd said, all right, we've detected that there's a growing potential for schismogenesis around this issue. Let's put it on the table and let's really talk it through. And is it an appropriate thing for schismogenesis? Because sometimes schismogenesis is the right answer. But in this case, I don't believe it would have been. And what are we pointing at when we take these two positions? Are they irreconcilable or are they reconcilable? And start with the assumption that they're reconcilable. How would we reconcile them? And so identifying this, the schismogenesis fault line early, put it on the table, and in good faith, rule omega, walk it through and really see if we can understand what's going on.
So early identification is crucial and is extremely hard.
Yep.
Right? On the personal, but even more so usually on the collective. Years ago, I started adding in important conversations. I started adding independent observers to the conversation to do that, right? To see what we're not seeing as we're part of the conversation. And then just recently, when I, for the first time, read the Stranger in a Strange Land book, there is a role in that world as well that does that kind of thing. They're
The fair
neutral.
witness. Yeah, the fair
Yeah,
witness.
the fair witness. Okay, so a guild of fair witnesses. Generally, I mean, just beyond this conversation, just beyond game B or game A, just a guild of fair witnesses that are neutral, independent observers, like described in that book, that can give an account that then can surface these kinds of things, right? Differences, unnoticed things that could be extremely helpful.
Yeah, I take your point. I think back to my own business career. I haven't really thought of it in those terms, but I think it was true. I had a guy who was my strategist for years, 10 years, 11 years. And one of his jobs was to attend important meetings and not say anything.
Mm-hmm.
And he would then give me his readout of what he had seen, right? Because I'm right in the middle of this. That's just my style, right? And other people, similarly, they're going fast and loose, and or I'm presenting something like, say, going out and raise money. That would be a fairly frequent thing, and I'd be giving my pitch. People would be asking me questions. I'd be giving my answers, but I was fully engaged in that gamesmanship. And having somebody sit back and say, okay, this was what was actually going on. Extremely valuable. Fair witness, interesting. There's actually another value of fair witnesses that I've contemplated recently, and that is the attestation to the reality of media artifacts. One of the huge problems we have now is that it's so easy and so inexpensive to build deep fakes, right? That can say absolutely anything, and it's taken a lot longer than people thought to be significant, but it's significant now. And having a guild of fair witnesses witness the video taking of, thus and such, and certify that this indeed did happen at this location at this time, and by the way, I'm available to testify to that effect. Could be valuable too, but let's get a little bit astray from what you're saying, which is that having let's call it a guild of neutral observers in itself could be hugely valuable.
Yeah, and the UN has instantiated some of that for itself, but those people get attacked really violently by the system itself, right? Because the system doesn't always want them to be neutral. So they need strong protection, maybe even stronger than journalists, which is, by the way, originally intended to be that function for society. And is also not resistant to hijack.
And of course,
so there needs to be strong error correction.
Journalism comes from a history of being advocates for point of view, right? It was only very late in the day that we thought of journalists as supposedly trying to be neutral. In fact, we know, though, that they're not in very many cases. But for the longest time, newspapers were very partisan, and publishers published pamphlets about their points of view. And, so it was the journalism field was, historically came from partisan and argumentative perspectives.
I think there's a nuance between journalism and reporter, right? So if you're a reporter, you're closer to the observer. And one could say that this is an important, valuable thing, like you say, in the current situation for sure, as we cannot trust media. But I think in about 5 years, we would have trouble trusting any virtual conversation, whether it is with video or without, that there's a human being on the other end. So building real relationship right now, if you are interested in global conversation beyond your physical space, now's the time to do that, because in about 5 years you won't know who you're talking to, whether it's a machine or a human.
Or at least it'll be more and more difficult. We'll probably, again, there could be things like fair witnesses that could augment that, but they'll be expensive. You have to say,
Correct.
Fair witness sitting in the chair behind me and one sitting on the chair behind you, that could easily cost, $200 an hour, which we could use for very important things, but we aren't going to be able to use for our routine conversations.
But these are interesting things that will come up for sure.
Yeah, they are coming up already, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have a few little secret codes I use that people know it's really me, for instance. Mm-hmm. But those such things are really hard to instantiate, make reliable, and for people to remember them and things of that sort.
No.
Of course, and there's crypto methods, of course. I could use my private key, but so far the infrastructure's just been a little too difficult and opaque for most people to adopt. PGP's been around for what, 30 years, right? How many people sign their emails with PGP? Not too many.
Okay, but back to the original point. So how to prevent schismogenesis inside of those in those conversations is an important point. And fair witnesses might be one modality. What other modalities would you see that could potentially be beneficial?
Yeah, and as I mentioned previously there, that getting it out on the table is probably way better than letting it fester until personal. This is what happened in the Game B case. They became personal grudges and elbows being thrown, rhetorically, not physically, until people's, feelings were hurt and such. If it had been gotten on the table 2 months or 3 months before, it could have been heated, but kept in the intellectual range rather than, becoming so personalized and just retreating to the worst examples of primate conflict metaphors, rather than being treated as what it was two different perspectives on essentially the same problem. So I think that's the benefit of getting it, catching it early and getting it on the table. And again, this may call for specialists. I learned late in the day, probably later than I wished I had, which is that at certain kinds of business meetings, hiring a paid facilitator was money well spent. Someone who was really good at making sure everybody got a chance to speak and make sure that nobody was too much the dominator, and that when there was unclarity, that there was focus on digging into the unclarity until it either evaporated or we realized we had to do more work to undo the unclarity. So we essentially have two possible roles to think about on addressing problems like this, which is one is the fair witness who is not a participant at all. In fact, presumably the Guild of Fair Witnessing, one of the rules are you may not speak at all, right, during
Hmm. Hmm.
the meetings that you witness. But then you will write a report afterwards, which says very specifically what you saw. And then the second is the meeting facilitator role, and
Hmm.
that's a special personality type.
Hmm.
Some people are terrible at it, like me. Other people I know are really good at it. And so,
Hmm.
nurturing and again, having a guild of meeting facilitators across all of Game B who share their lessons with each other and what works and what doesn't work, I think could be two very useful things that would have probably, the two of them together would have probably turned what was a legitimate difference in perspective into a useful and hopefully generative conversation.
I think part of the hope that we're laying out here of the fair witness surfacing the undercurrents part of it potentially is already here, because I know people who are using AI in order to do that in their personal relationships even. So if a couple has an argument, they record it, and then they let the AI tell them what they're not seeing.
Whoa, that's an
Um,
interesting idea.
right? So for having these kinds of group conversations that in which it is possible or there's a felt sense that something's off, recording them and then having a truly neutral machine play back at you what is actually happening here could be extremely valuable.
I can see that being very, very valuable. Of course, there's also the risk that the LLM used was biased in some strong sense, but it would not be too hard to get LLMs that were neutral enough for this purpose. In fact,
Yeah,
probably the
or
opposite.
have an interplay of some, right? So of several,
Yeah.
to
I would say
to
today's
critique
public
each other.
frontier models are probably good enough and unbiased enough to, in general, be
Mm.
useful in this case.
Hmm.
Uh, the marital argument, that's a scary and interesting one. Right?
Well, to surface some neutrality, I haven't done it yet, but I'm really tempted to.
Yeah, maybe I'll go
Um,
start an argument with my wife today and then record it. And not that we argue too often, but when we do, it can be pretty good.
yeah, I can see that. Well, if you do, tell her I'm sorry that I instigated that.
Yeah,
Um,
well, but yeah, it's interesting. That's very interesting. Yep. And this whole to kick this up a bit. What
mm,
this really means is that there's a set of technologies, both social and technical in the more mechanical sense, uh, tooling that needs to be brought to living together in community.
mhm,
The anti-schismogenesis thing, fair witnesses, facilitators, uh, AI, if not adjudicators, analyzers.
mhm,
Um, it'd be interesting. One of the parts we imagine in most Game B small communities is a blend of consensus, democracy, and executive operation.
mhm,
And particularly things like the consensus meetings are likely to have a lot of talk and be hard
mhm,
to parse.
mhm,
And AI might actually be good at that, better
mhm,
at it than most humans.
mhm. Yeah,
It
it
would be
should be
that.
part of the stack, and then the stack ultimately needs to be um, owned by the commons for it not to be hijackable by any biases, and that
Subject to
also
radical transparency. So anyone that wants to
correct.
understand it can. If they want to run tests against it, they can.
Exactly. And that requires funding. And then we're at this other point of the economic machinery, right? Until this is viable, sufficiently viable, there's some startup cost that somehow needs to be carried. And the question of how to think about funding that in a way that it is it won't compromise the fabric of what's being built. Like the hijacking of the hippie culture into the music industry, etc. It could be an example of this, right? So
Why don't we
how
save
is
this
that
for?
done?
Let's save this for our next call because we got like 15 minutes left, and this is a
Yeah,
conversation that we could easily
we do.
spend a full call on. So let's kick this
Okay,
to the next conversation.
we do.
This is right in the middle of some of my thinking right now, so it'd be very timely.
Nice.
And it's also, I continue to have
Yeah.
conversations with people on why these things have failed in the past. And a very good conversation with Rufus Pollock from Life Itself last
Did
week.
you? I spoke with him like 2 hours ago.
Interesting. Well, anyway, his podcast will be out on Wednesday, I think it is. And
Nice.
it was a
Okay.
wonderful conversation.
Yeah, he's a cool guy.
Imagine. And he's attempted to build some communities too. And so I asked him, all right, what are the failure modes? He says, money is often a failure mode, insufficiently capitalized, which of course we've known. I've known particularly. That's always been one of my big bugbears about startup companies. You got to have enough capital to get across the valley of death, right? Most Game B-ish, Game B adjacent things are undercapitalized. But he said, actually, in his experience, while that's a big one, the inability to manage the group itself is actually bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And that things like the schismogenesis we talked about are what actually broke up at least as many attempts as funding. So I think that's actually an interesting data point. You got to solve both, right?
That's interesting. I'll pick that up with him.
Yeah.
Nice. Because
actually, let me throw a crazy analog here to you.
Yeah, please.
Which is the Fermi paradox. Why don't we see aliens out there if there are actually lots of them out there that are at a technological level? And Robin Hanson came up with the concept of the great filter, that there's some filter that massively reduces the number of technological civilizations in the galaxy. And he talks about filters prior to now. For instance, maybe life is really hard to get going, or maybe animal life is very hard to get going, or maybe neurons are very hard to evolve. And then the other ones he calls the great filters past us, which is maybe every civilization like ours invents nuclear weapons and destroys itself, or gets taken over by its AIs, etc. So let's imagine using that concept of the great filter to alternative social operating systems. Why do they fail? Do they fail for reasons before them? Say insufficient funding or bad selection of people, etc., or do they fail for reasons past them? Inability to deal with schismogenesis, inability to reach viability in terms of membrane flows between A and B, etc. I'm gonna give some thought to that. Recasting Fermi paradox, great filter around alternative social operating systems.
Okay, we have 2 topics for the next 2 sessions: the money and the filter. Great filter.